we've already seen the impact that COVID and the smartphone has had on young people's ability to form lasting social bonds with one another, to have deep conversations and deep relationships. And who knows already what knock-on impact that's going to have 10 years down the road to the population, let alone anything else. If young men can't find young women to build the population without some other artificial intervention, we're going to have problems, guys. That's the way it's going. Add to the ability for you to have a virtual girlfriend or a virtual boyfriend and fall in love with the chatbot and be totally happy with that, I think is a relational category that we don't want to see emerge. And that's actually probably the more likely worst case scenario, that we are already seeing companies building tools, building experiences where you can essentially take a step back from society and have pretty much everything done for you, both your work product, your relational product, your, call it whatever aspect of your life you want managed. And we end up in a kind of, you remember that Disney movie WALL-E, right? We kind of end up in that kind of all sat slightly in a half vegetative state, looking like a potato, leaning back, watching a recycling truck clean up the world. That's not a great outcome, generally speaking.
Welcome to the Carey Nieuwhof Leadership Podcast on YouTube. I'm so glad that you joined us. Hey, today we're talking about all things AI. What are the best and worst case scenarios for AI in the next 10 years? And then what are some practical apps that you're missing that could really save you hours, if not staff members? So we're going to talk about all of that. Hey, if you're new here, which is most of you, subscribe. Make sure you do that, because then you'll never miss world-class interviews. I am talking to Charles Duhigg in the future about super communicators, sitting down with Ken Blanchard, having conversations with Andy Stanley and Ed Stetzer. Hey, none of those are up yet, but if you subscribe, you won't miss a thing. Well, today's episode is brought to you by my live event called the Art of Leadership Live. And if you're looking to level up your leadership, level up your church, I'm hosting my very first conference, the Art of Leadership Live in Dallas, Texas, September 16th to 18th. It's a very small, bespoke, curated event. And if you're ready to break free from what's been holding you back, secure your spot by visiting theartofleadershiplive.com. I'd love to see you in Dallas. Hurry, because things are filling up really, really quickly. And also, today's episode is brought to you by 10 by 10. So if you're a youth pastor, you're probably trying to connect with the next generation. Well, you got to figure out exactly how to do it. They have a free assessment for you that you can learn by going to 10by10.org/RDI, and you can get your free assessment right away, absolutely no charge to you, and it's your Relational Discipleship Inventory. And now, my conversation with the one and only JP Poulter about AI. JP, welcome to the podcast.
Carey, thanks so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
Yeah, so I want to start in the deep end. What are the threats of AI? There's two different views, right? There's the benevolent view of AI, and then there's the malevolent view of AI. So from where you sit, what are the threats, the existential threats that AI poses right now?
Well, I think the biggest distinction is that I'm not sure that AI is the existential threat, but it's AI in the hands of humans that might be the existential threat, which is probably an important distinction. In the church, we have a habit, sometimes a nasty one when it comes to technology, of looking for 666 in the code of everything that we use, assuming that there's something evil lying behind it. And I don't think that that's what's happening here, but we obviously know from all the work that's being done across the industry that AI does have the potential to radically transform society, and particularly when put in the hands of those that may not want to use it for good, can really have some pretty devastating impacts on things like the economy, on politics, and on the geopolitical space. There's a real opportunity that things could go awry with AI being used by bad actors. But AI itself doesn't seem to, at the moment, want to come and kill us all, even though it might have the potential to do so. So I don't think that we are starting the conversation from a position that we should be fearful of AI. But we are in a position where we need to be faithful with it, and particularly take a considered approach to how we use it as Christians and how we bring it into the church and everything else that we do.
One of the things that I think about a lot is unintended consequences. So, if you look at social media a decade ago, most people, well, maybe not a decade ago, but 15 years ago as it was developing, most people would say, oh, this is good. We had no idea it would produce the unintended consequences, particularly among teenage girls. Gen Z with the anxiety. Jonathan Haidt has done some incredible work in that area this year. Just highlighting,
right. Yeah,
it's like
I just got finished reading The Anxious Generation, and I think we see that those like second and third order consequences just couldn't have been anticipated when that technology emerged.
Well, exactly. And I mean, I didn't see it either, and I was an avid adapter, and now I realize, oh yeah, this is messing with my brain too. So when you think about AI in the future, one of the sub-arguments under how social media is used, but also AI, is it's all monetized. Like there's government policy can hardly keep up. The EU has done probably the best job globally or worst job, depending on how you look at it, of regulating technology. But like the government doesn't even understand it. And I was reading some backstory on Sam Altman being kicked out of the board for OpenAI earlier this year, and then being brought back in after he was offered by Microsoft. And it seemed to be the backstory there, from what I can determine, and again, I don't know Sam Altman, and I don't live in Silicon Valley, is that it was his seeming lack of regard for the human consequences of AI, and really the race to be first to market, dominant in market, profit. Any thoughts on that, when really you can make an argument with the Magnificent Seven that it's just a race to shareholders' greatest profitability, to be first, et cetera? Yeah. Is that what you mean by the existential threat being in the hands of humans? Or what's your take on monetization and all of this?
Well, so the existential threat problem mostly comes from these models getting out of hand and into the hands of those that might use them for nefarious purposes. We think about things like fake news, mass generation of content that may affect elections. Obviously, we're in the year, as we record, of the elections. Yeah. And depending on when this comes out, we'll see how many of those it's been affected by AI. But I would guess a lot.
A lot.
Whether or not there's a real effect, or at least a correlatory effect that we point at and say, hey, there was fake news in the ecosystem, it'll be hard to make an argument with anybody that that's not really been the case. Mm-hmm. Whether or not it's had any real causal effect on the outcome of elections, that's yet to be seen. But certainly that it'll be out there, and it'll be something that people point at. And that in itself is disruptive, right? When something like this new technology comes into the space, long before, think back to Cambridge Analytica, think back to what happened with Facebook. Long before anyone found out there was something going on under the hood there, people were still pointing at Facebook and pointing at many other social platforms and saying, this is going to have a negative effect on our elections or on the outcome of other social issues. And I think we can already do that with AI in an unchecked, unregulated way. Now, the good thing is, I do think global regulators are learning from what's happened in the social media space. And as you say, in the EU and in the US and around the world, people will move fast to try and bring some kind of regulation in. But the big difference here is that this isn't a channel that we're talking about. AI isn't something that just becomes one person's job in the company or one person's job in the church. This affects everything. It's affecting all the tools that we use now, even the things we're using to record this podcast, or the computer that you're using today. Certainly the phone that you're going to use in the next 24 months is going to have some kind of AI living inside of it. And until we all have a better understanding of what that means for us, we're not going to be turning it off by default. We're most of the time going to be opted into it. And so we could accidentally, if we're not careful, sleepwalk into another type of experience that we've had with social media, where we are falling foul to giving our data over to platforms that may want to use it for different purposes, even if that's just to monetize it with us not knowing about it. Even if that's just the worst thing that happens, that's still something that could be happening to us that we might not want to be participating in. I think that's why we've got to be cautious.
A strange analogy here, but I just interviewed William Ury, who will be on the podcast. So he wrote the infamous Getting to Yes, Fisher and Ury, and has been involved in really the biggest negotiations of the last 50 years. And although we didn't spend a lot of time on it in the conversation, I remember talking to him off mic about the arms race, like the START talks, the SALT talks. You're probably too young to remember those in real time. I was in college. I remember them.
I've read about them.
And there was the arms race, right? Like in the 80s, that was a very real thing. And it looked like, there was the MAD Pact, the mutually assured destruction, that if the United States or the Soviet Union, now Russia, press a nuclear button, the planet was blown to smithereens in minutes. And we came close a few times, and then that decelerated. So do you see right now we kind of have another race in technology to the top?
Yeah.
It's profit driven. It's not driven by states and governments. It's driven by private industry. Do you see any kind of, and I know you work in this area, hence the question, any kind of not external ethical counsel, but internal, where OpenAI sits down with Anthropic, sits down with the thousands of startups, with Meta, and says, hey, what are we doing here that will benefit humanity? Do you see any of that happening, or is that really left to outside actors?
Well, I think that it's definitely coming because the pressure is there for them to all be on the same page. The challenge, obviously, with the commercial side of it is that none of them want to share their toys, right? They all want to keep their own little special sauce. And that's understandable too. I mean, the AI wars, they're basically becoming a proxy for the cloud wars that we've seen over the past decade of, the Amazons, the Googles, they're competing. But the difference is that they've all been leapfrogged by some of these startups that they couldn't have anticipated at the time. And hence the investments that are coming in left, right, and center. What's really interesting, if you look at the board makeup of many of these companies, they've got people sitting across them from all these different companies on each other's boards. They're building up different teams. You've got people like from Google that are now on the Anthropic board. You've got Amazon investing in them as well as Google investing in them. And so it does make the landscape quite muddled, but they all are essentially moving towards the same thing of for profit as the means of growing these things. And there's nothing necessarily intrinsically wrong with that. But the accountability is the thing that we want to see. And obviously that's the work that's being done by the EU with the AI Act that's just been passed, is what's going through Congress at the moment. And I'm sure what will be coming out in both the Canadian and the UK governments as they try and bring something that's of parity to those registrations and legislations. But the challenge is, how will we as a society respond to this? I think that's the bigger problem, because governments, they're great at regulating big companies. It's much easier for them to do because there's less people they have to talk to. But I kind of look at it as the analogy of like when we wanted to make cars safer, we had to do two things at the same time. You had to go to Ford and GM and Volvo and everyone and say, hey, put seatbelts in the car. And that was one part of the problem. And then the other part of the problem was telling all of us to put the seatbelts on when we got in the car.
Yeah.
And that's the bit that seems to me is missing. We're not seeing an awful lot of work by governments, regulators, but other public bodies to make sure that, Carey knows what he's doing with his data and JP knows what he's doing with his data, and just put that on a higher pedestal than we do right now. And we see this, all across the place. And, you mentioned Jonathan Haidt's work around the anxious generation. We're just handing over so much of our data in the form of our smartphones, and particularly we're handing over those smartphones to our kids without training them on, hey, this is what's going on with the data that you're giving away when you sign that little tick box without reading the terms and conditions. That's where we need to be paying more attention.
So does anybody read the terms and conditions? Like, seriously?
No.
I know. And then it's accept all cookies, decline all cookies, or worse, manage your preferences. And I've hit the manage your preferences. Right. And I'm led into this confusing landscape that I'm just like, all right, I'll just accept them. What's at stake in moments like that where we're accepting terms and conditions and cookies? And I know that Google's going to change that massively this year as well with the death of third-party cookies. But
well, I mean, the history of the internet is us giving up privacy for utility, right?
Yeah.
If we find enough utility in anything, we'll give up some privacy for it. Every time that you want an Uber to arrive and find you on the street, you're giving up a little bit of privacy for that utility. The same if you want your Shopify account to remember your login details, or if you want to use Meta products to browse what your college roommates are up to. Every time we do that, we're giving up some level of privacy for that social utility back. And the history of, as I say, the internet says that we will continue to do that because as humans, just by our very nature, we're quite lazy animals. We like to find straight paths between point A and point B. And as long as we're those lazy animals, we'll continue to find ways, even self-inflicted, of exploiting that laziness to get what we want. And that's where the biggest problem is that most often these products are not particularly clear about what they're doing with the data. And even if they are clear with what they're doing with the data, they're moving at such a speed that we can't really know 5-10 years from now what this is going to look like. The AI that we have today, as our mutual friend Kelly Zhang says, is the dumbest it will ever be.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah.
And That's the thing that we can't anticipate. If you even think about the advancements we've seen in the past 48 months, from these quite simple language models, things like Alexa, things like Google Assistant, then we get the first versions of ChatGPT that can just about write something interesting. But then these leaps and bounds to the video and the imagery that they're able to create. If that curve continues to grow exponentially 5 years from now, 10 years from now, we can't even imagine what these things are going to be able to do. And they're all learning from the data that we're giving them right now. And they'll learn from the data that we create using these tools in the years to come. And so that's why we need to take more accountability for what we're using them for.
Well, this is relevant on an individual user basis, but also for all the leaders who run organizations, whose organizations are collecting this kind of information too, right? So 2 questions for you. Number one, what do you do? Do you accept all cookies? Do you decline some? Do you manage your preferences? What do you do personally with that? Knowing what you know, which is, probably more than most of us listening to this podcast, and certainly more than the person conducting this interview.
I think you're more educated than you let on.
I
would say
little knowledge is dangerous, JP. It's very dangerous.
I try. I think I try, but I'm not going to say that I'm not guilty of this myself, because I too want all of those things. Right. But I would be, particularly when it comes to these AI tools that are now being built on top of the language models. Let's move like the social networks and other things like the iTunes privacy agreement to one side, and think about particularly these AI tools. One of the things I'm always doing is looking at what models are they built on top of. You've obviously got things like ChatGPT, which we all know. Many people might have tried out something like Claude or Perplexity. And then there's the new AIs that tend to feel more friendly, like the Pi from Inflection. Some of these tools you guys may find, or you'll find in the show notes, I'm sure. But these new types of tools, they're not always the experience that you're having with them, at least, is not always built by that same company. We're seeing lots of startups, lots of people building new experiences that you can use on your phone or on the desktop that are wrappers on top of other language models.
Like a skin, right?
Exactly.
It's a skin with some prompt engineering and specialized utility.
If you don't know what model is underneath that, you don't know where your data is ultimately going to and what it's being used for in the future. Now, I personally, I don't think there's anything particularly nefarious going on at any of these companies right now. There's no evidence to suggest that from what I'm seeing. They all ultimately, as you've alluded to before, are commercial enterprises and they want to make money. And the minute that they lose our trust is the minute they stop making money. So there is that kind of interesting tension that the commercial aspect of all of this holds. But doesn't mean that the companies building on top of these things don't want to do things that either are not, like I say, bad in themselves, but they may not be things that we necessarily want to support as a society, and particularly within leadership or within church contexts. These are the issues that I think we want to pay more attention to, because just because something can be done doesn't necessarily mean that it should be done, or certainly that we would want it to be done.
So when you think about the future, I like to think in terms of trajectory or trend lines, JP. So, if you look at the decline of the church over time, there's a trend line. And even after COVID, I was reading a few graphs recently. Basically, there's an pattern interruption, and then it continues on the historic trend line down, which is really too bad. Other companies like the rise of tech, market capitalization or user share, the trend line is here's 2010, here's 2015, here's 2020, here's 2024. It's up, right? So with no future intervention beyond what we see now, I'd like to go into the worst case for AI and the best case for AI. So, and I know, ask 10 people, get 10 opinions. I get it. But I would love your take as somebody who's literally built and sold companies in AI and who sits on a board and, has your resume. What is the worst case that we could imagine a world 5-10 years down the road in terms of AI and where it's going?
Well, if anyone has watched the recent Mission Impossible movies, they'll have seen what looks like potentially the worst case scenario, which is some kind of large-scale AI emerges as being, I would not say sentient, because I'm not sure that that's actually possible within our theology, but with something that emerges with a super intelligence that is beyond our control and starts deciding that either it's going to align itself with those that would seek to see the downfall of society or the end of the Western world, or however you want to put it, or that it just makes that decision in and of itself and says, you know what, humans, you're not doing a great job looking after this planet. Maybe we would be better off without you. And that argument has been made by many. The likelihood of that happening, I think, is far off, because I think there are many steps between here and there before we get anywhere near that being a challenge. But it's not entirely impossible. And because it's not entirely impossible, we should at least give it some level of attention, if nothing else, to make sure it shapes the way that we follow policy and that we keep away from those things, in the same way that we did with nuclear weapons, which is often the comparison. And probably more importantly, the way that we didn't really do it with social media, which is probably a more accurate comparison in terms of the actual net impact that it's had on people around the world. So I think in terms of worst case scenarios, that's kind of out there in the existential threat category. But what I think is more the likely worst case scenario is that these models continue to grow unchecked, and that we just begin to adopt them into society in a way that we just wouldn't want to see happen. I think the one area that I'm particularly passionate about is in relationships. We've already seen the impact that COVID and the smartphone has had on young people's ability to form lasting social bonds with one another, to have deep conversations and deep relationships. And who knows already what knock-on impact that's going to have 10 years down the road to the population, let alone anything else. If young men can't find young women to build the population with without some other artificial intervention, we're going to have problems, guys. That's the way it's going. Add to the ability for you to have a virtual girlfriend or a virtual boyfriend and fall in love with the chatbot and be totally happy with that, I think is a relational category that we don't want to see emerge. And that's actually probably the more likely worst case scenario, that we are already seeing companies building tools, building experiences where you can essentially take a step back from society and have pretty much everything done for you, both your work product, your relational product, your call it whatever aspect of your life you want managed. And we end up in a kind of, you remember that Disney movie WALL-E, right? We kind of end up in that kind of all sat slightly in a half vegetative state, looking like a potato, leaning back, watching a recycling truck clean up the world. That's not a great outcome, generally speaking. And that's before they all had AI friends. They at least were talking to one another. So I think that's where we could end up in some form. And that is, to me, a more likely worst case scenario than necessarily, something releases all the nukes or turns off all of the energy grid.
Yeah, and so sort of a general social degradation over what we have now. And for regular listeners, Scott Galloway is on this here. Yeah. Again, I don't know exactly when compared when all the episodes will be released, but he sees that as a massive threat to our culture, is disengaged young men. He says that's where things go bad. All right, now be the optimist. I'm sure you've got an optimistic framework. Again, all things being equal, nothing in the future radically changing from the current trajectory. What is the possible best case scenario?
Well, I think this is interesting. You recently had Morgan on your show, I think, talking about kind of the things that don't change. Morgan Housel.
Yes, I'm going to have him. Yeah.
Or you're going to have him
plan.
On. And he is his recent book, I think, is really fascinating because he talks about the things that don't change over time. And I think that's actually more likely. There's a bunch of human characteristics that don't change. As much as we're worried about things like AI girlfriends and stuff, I actually think that the overwhelming majority of us still find the pull to be with one another in the physical space. The real optimistic view of AI is that it can just take away so many of the drudgery tasks that we all have to deal with, particularly in ministry contexts or work contexts. We spend so much time administering the work we do rather than doing ministry, or we spend so much time, on the busy work that's often called, rather than actually being busy working on the thing that we want to focus on. And AI does hold the promise to be able to eliminate vast amounts of that work, days, if not weeks, a year of that, filling in a spreadsheet or entering a form for the 17th time that was built on, Windows 97 or whatever it might be. These things are out there still. And as much as the technical world has been revolutionized, you walk into any public municipal building or hospital or school, and you'll find technologies that have been leapfrogged time and time again still running in many of these places. And AI potentially could come along and, if not replace those technologies, just fill those things in for us, which would make things a lot easier for most of our lives. So administration, I think, is going to be one of the big things that maybe we do end up in the world of being able to do the 4-day work week and, living that kind of dream that Tim Ferriss has been selling to us for a number of years, that we actually might have some lifestyle, benefit over time. I think that's one of the big things. But it's also imperative, right? Like if we want to solve some of the biggest issues in the world, climate change, cancer, other kind of diseases, and also make sure that our politics is actually something that can sustain itself over time. We haven't done a great job of that as of late as the human race since the Industrial Revolution. And those problems are now so big that the speed required to fix them doesn't seem to be possible in and of ourselves. And so my optimistic view would be that we will see massive breakthroughs, whether it's the work that's being done on things like protein folding or the discovery of new drugs, the identification of new cancers, the solving of the climate race, or emergence of things like nuclear, small nuclear fusion and nuclear fission reactors, which will give us boundless energy sources. We're not going to get to those things without artificial intelligence. We don't have the collective brain power on our own. And so I think that we could begin to see the new renaissance begin to emerge over the next decade as these technologies get smarter, so long as the negative opportunities don't outweigh the positive ones, and that people continue to seek for human flourishing rather than the rather commercial, sad story that is being told at the moment, just flooding the internet with garbage content. Like that's what seems to be more likely right now. But I'm hopeful that we might see a new generation of technologists arrive that say, wow, we can use this stuff to do immense good.
We'll probably toggle between the macro and the micro, but to dip down into the micro for a moment, what are some of the most interesting uses of AI that you're seeing right now? And I'd love you to take that in 2 phases. Number 1, just what's on your phone, what's on your laptop that you're finding absolutely fascinating on a micro level, and then other technologies that perhaps you haven't discovered personally yet, but are out there. What's got your attention?
Well, I mean, the app that probably gets more attention on my phone, if I think about it here, than any other is Perplexity at the moment. As a search engine, it has almost entirely replaced my use of Google. This is not an endorsement for them. I don't have any particular affiliation to them. No, nothing of that nature. But I would just say, from straight out usage, it's amazing how quickly that has replaced things. A story from this week: a client rang us out of the blue at Vixen Labs, the agency that I run, saying, hey, I got in touch with you because I found an article about the very specific thing I was looking to do with AI this week, and you were the top answer ranked on Perplexity, because it was found very specifically the article he was looking for in a way that Google had no ranking for us whatsoever. And even if you take that in microcosm, it's a really good example of how these new tools are helping find much more contextual information. So Perplexity, I think, is amazing. If nothing else, because I can ask it questions and then ask it follow-up questions, and it seems to do a better job of looking at stuff than I can do on my own, just Googling.
Google search has so degraded over the last couple of years. I know they keep making changes, but it's not functionally useless, but it's approaching that.
And well, once these Gemini models begin to roll out into mainstream Google search, which we can only anticipate they will, then I think there's a real chance Google catches up. But for now, for me, I spend an awful lot of time in Perplexity. For anyone that makes slideware or content for the internet, which is all of us that get stuck in PowerPoint from time to time, I've been using tools like Beautiful.ai, which has an amazing ability for, if you're a pastor or an executive leader of some description right now, having to put together this year's annual report or quarterly earnings, being able to design a slide deck which has the Claude model from Anthropic running inside of it. You can create an entire 20-slide presentation with 1-line text prompt. It does the layouts for you. It goes to DALL-E and creates images for you. It chooses the most appropriate slide layout. Like, it's an amazing tool. Again, not aligned with them, but just that's the one that I spend literally hours in every single day.
So Perplexity and Beautiful.ai.
Yeah, for sure. Those are two.
I'll be checking those out. Those are new to me. I've heard of them, but I haven't done anything. with them.
Yeah, they're definitely great places to start. And if you are already using something like ChatGPT, you can access the GPT-4 models, you can access the Claude models inside of Perplexity as well. So you can switch around and pay one subscription price.
Is it just helpful. Me, or is Claude significantly more intelligent than ChatGPT-4 right now?
It's certainly more eloquent, not necessarily more intelligent, which is really interesting. What we're beginning to see with some of these models, they're bringing personality in some ways.
Yeah.
The Claude model is particularly good at long form written content.
Oh, that's probably why I like it.
Yeah, well, for you, exactly. And for myself as well. Like, it's much better at emulating my voice when I give it examples than ChatGPT is. And it sticks to the task for longer than kind of wandering off and doing something strange, which GPT can kind of be prone to do. So, yeah, I would definitely say Claude is also a really good place to play around with, particularly if you're a content creator. If you're a writer, if you're someone that writes press releases or social media content or, biographies or whatever it might be, anything that's longer form, Claude is probably your go-to model right now for doing that well. And what's really promising is those models are getting small enough to be able to run on a phone offline, which opens up some really interesting opportunities in places where connectivity is bad, or parts of the world where AI tools would be pretty hard to justify just because of the amount of data that they use. So I'm particularly excited about where they might go.
Yeah, that's interesting. So again, a 101 question, and by the way, for Canadian listeners, most are American. You can't get Claude, at least at the time of recording this, but a VPN will work you around that pretty easily.
Well, yeah. And you can also access it via some of these other tools as well, which is, again, the thing we were saying before about some of these tools, they have other models inside of them. So, your mileage might vary, but play around.
And a VPN's a great idea anyway on public internet. But beyond that, that's a virtual private network. Claude, by the way, is CLAUDE .ai. And so help me understand, as somebody who does not code and someone who is not into AI deeply, ChatGPT is an LLM. Claude is an LLM as well, large language model. Is that right? But they're trained on different things. Like, I don't understand, because they are very different. Like, user interface, Claude is like, oh, that was really helpful. ChatGPT is one more time, please, with feeling, Yeah.
So it's helpful to understand the difference between a large language model and the app that you might use that thing in.
Yeah.
So Claude there are a number of different Claude models. It doesn't help that they're called Claude as well, but there are a number of different Claude models. If you go to Claude.ai, you can interact with the Claude model, or at the time of recording, it may be a different one from when you're listening to this, but the Claude 3 model or Claude 4, Claude 5, whatever comes down the line. So the language model itself is trained on a massive amount of human created data, some synthetic created data living on the internet. And depending on who you're getting that model from, they've sourced it from different places. Some have more commercial agreements in place, others are just scraping stuff that's in the public domain. But the big difference is the way that they're trained and tuned to behave in different ways. And then when you come and use them inside of a tool, for example, inside of ChatGPT, you're using what is probably the GPT 3.5 or GPT-4 model. Mm-hmm. Those different models have different amounts of data in them, different knowledge, and they behave in slightly different ways. But you can access both of them inside of the ChatGPT app. And it's the same models that if you use Bing Chat, for example, mm-hmm. or you're using Microsoft Copilot, you're using the GPT-4 model inside of those tools. Right. And they have different abilities too. So
that's
Bing
sort of the
Search,
skin idea, right?
Yeah. But so Bing Search uses the same model that ChatGPT has, but it has the ability to go to the internet and pull in real-time results and blend it with the content that the model can produce. The same thing that Perplexity is able to do when they're using their own Perplexity search model, and Claude isn't able to do in and of itself because it doesn't have live internet access. So they all have slightly different abilities. It's kind of like having a range of different assistants that you might employ to different jobs. Some of them are going to be better at different things. And so ChatGPT is particularly good at like tasks and handling data. It's particularly good at writing code. Claude is much better at linguistic tasks, long-form textual tasks. And neither of those produce images, but that's why you have things like DALL-E from OpenAI or Mistral, and there are many others that can produce visuals as well.
Okay, so just from a basic thing, Anthropic, which is the company behind Claude, are they working totally independently from ChatGPT. Like there's no master data source. These are two separate companies that have developed things from scratch. As far as we're aware, there's no.
As far as we're aware.
Let's not get into conspiracy theories.
Well, no, but it is an important thing to highlight that none of these companies publish exactly what data has been trained to make them work. Not in full anyway, even the open source ones. Now you can begin to get an understanding of what might be in there because we've seen examples, and this is the basis of the court case being held by the New York Times against OpenAI at the moment, is that clearly ChatGPT is able to produce, or at least was able to produce long form examples of what seem to be exactly copies of New York Times articles. Therefore, you can assume it was in the training data. It may no longer be. And so each of these different models, they have slightly different training data that goes inside of them. And that's what makes them better or worse at certain tasks. There are some models that are trained, for example, just on scientific papers. And so scientific papers, if you're going to write them, they have a very specific linguistic style, a way of referencing, etc. And so you would want a model that was trained on that. And this is where we see a lot of companies going right now, is building on top of these language models with their own data sets. So you've seen examples from Bloomberg doing it with financial data, or McKinsey, the consulting firm, doing it with all of their consulting content. And we're now seeing in the Christian world, Bibles being built on top. I've just seen the release this past couple of weeks of Bible.ai, which is a project that's trying to build a large corpus of Christian content to train a foundational language model so it's better at producing biblical related content. So we're going to see examples of that type of thing emerge as well.
It'd be fun to see him merge so many different theologies into one. That'll be absolutely fascinating to watch.
Well, and that's the problem, right? Because first of all, if you want to put something in them, you've got to agree that what we agree on, which is not always the easiest of things.
Okay, I'm going to have to track that one. No, that's a good survey of the landscape. It really is, JP. You specialize in conversational AI. What is that?
So we started Vixen Labs, which is the agency I've run for the past 5 or 6 years, really with the intent around making experiences of talking with the companies and the organizations that you have to do business with every day a little bit better through talking to them rather than having to click and scroll and swipe down.
Is this like instead of press 5?
Precisely. We've been really focused on things like voice technologies. We spend a lot of time building applications for Alexa, for Google Assistant over the past couple of years. And now that's emerged into these large language models that can help us build things like chatbots and voice assistants that are just much more pleasurable to use and actually helpful than they have been historically, more than just doing timers and reminders, which is what they've been good for a little while. So we focus on that because I think we want the future of using the internet to be one that's just a little bit more personal and more human, ironically, which we are conversational animals, right? That's how we get things done. Whether you don't roll up at McDonald's drive-through and order to have a chat with someone, but the means that you do so, the means you get that burger delivered into the car or whatever your order is through the art of conversation, and that's the way we've always done things as humans. We believe, certainly from a Christian perspective, that we began with the word, right? And so we know that conversation and the art of talking to one another is an important thing. So I would love to see more of our technology head in that direction rather than it being this kind of screens in front of us at all times, head down in a phone. We think that by bringing the ability to talk to and type to, if necessary, tech, it lifts us out of that trap and lifts us out of that doom scrolling mentality.
Oh, that's a great thing. So for those who have called Apple in the last 6-7 years, you would be familiar with that kind of conversational AI where it's like, I'm a fully trained voice specialist that can help you. What's wrong, And then you tell it, my computer won't boot up. And it's like, oh, it sounds like you need technical support. Hang on, I'll put you right through. That kind of thing.
Well, so that's I think what we would see as conversational tech like 1.0. It's emerged from natural language processing and being able to natural language understanding. So that is the press 1 for this and it knows at least what you said.
Yes.
But the difference now we see is with these language models is that you could say the entire thing of what's wrong with your MacBook, and if Apple chose or other manufacturers chose to put these systems in place, it could do what ChatGPT could do, which is take all of that information from you directly and actually give you the answer. It would probably work it out pretty well.
That's fantastic.
Because it's the same technology. It's the same technology. It's just being spoken to you rather than showing you as a line of text on screen. And we're seeing this now. If you use the ChatGPT app on your phone, you can talk to it and it talks back to you in a variety of different voices. And you can always flick away and look at the screen. But actually, that experience of talking to these things with your voice is actually quite delightful, and certainly feels far more human, even though it's not, than typing into a screen or into a text box.
Yeah. All right. I want to talk about, because you work with Ecclesii. How do you pronounce it?
Ecclesii, I think, is the pronunciation we're going with. But seeing it written down is different.
It's a think tank that is starting to process, or that is processing, the theological issues associated with AI. What is, if you were to look at an agenda of what consumes your time and Ecclesii's time, what are the top 2 or 3 things on your agenda right now? What are you working on?
So I think at Ecclesii, we founded the think tank at the end of 2023 as we began to see the emergence of the church really responding to the AI revolution, and particularly for church leaders in all contexts, whether that's in ministry, in parachurch organizations, in nonprofits, but Christian leaders looking for guidance on how do I wrestle with some of these big topics that are arising. And broadly speaking, we've rallied around 3 big areas. One is to have a better theology of AI, because it does raise some existential questions. Maybe we can get into those. I know you've done a lot on that in the past. But then the practical and the pastoral implications are the other 2 real areas. So practically, what does it mean to have an AI policy for your church or for your charity? What does it mean to have a code of ethics? How will you physically go around choosing which tools to use and which ones that sit outside of things? And then pastorally, using that as a kind of broad catch-all, is how do you deal with the issues that arise from AI in ministry or in society? And I always use this example, which I know is maybe a bit trite, but when a young person comes to a youth worker and says, "Hey, I've fallen in love with this chatbot. What do I do?" How does a youth worker or a minister in that context respond to that question? Like, what do they actually say? Do they acknowledge the feelings, which may be very real for that young person who feels like they truly have a relationship with these things? We've seen examples in recent months of people sadly committing suicide when these bots break up with them, or that they have tried to marry them. That we've seen both the good and the bad of these things, and that's already now, let alone 24 months from now when this stuff gets really smart. So how do we contend with these issues? That this is the stuff we're trying to wrestle with, because even if you choose not to, quote unquote, use AI in your ministry, your congregations, those that you're trying to seek to reach and be impacted, and certainly on the mission field, they will be using it. There's no way that we're putting this back in the box. And so what we really want to see at Ecclesii is the church be prepared and equipped to respond to that situation, and to be able to roll with these things as they emerge, not be caught on the back foot, as we've so often seen it be the way in the past when it comes to technology and the church, where we're often bad at it, or often late, or often both. And I think we could do a better job of it this time around.
I really appreciate it. And that example of somebody falling in love with an AI or a chatbot has been used before on this podcast. And it sounds like science fiction, but it's not science fiction.
Yeah, so I mean, one of the things that we see, and I saw this at a hackathon that I was at recently, where there was an example of a church organization that was trying to create a technology using CCTV and AI, and it could do face tracking to monitor attendance. Now, there's probably a bunch of good reasons why you might want to do that, but there's also a lot of challenges with it as well, right? Totally doable with existing technology, like plug together a few different tools, totally doable right now. Should it be done? I think real problematic use case, because the minute you start tracking who's there, who's not, who's to stop someone calling them up and saying, "Hey, your giving looks like it's dropped this past month and you've not been at church 3 times," or worse, "Hey, I saw you sit next to the same woman 3 times in the past month in church and she's not your wife and your wife wasn't there. Is there something going on there?" Like, these are scenarios that, again, it's not about the AI being nefarious. It's AI in the hands of someone that might use it in the wrong way that is the problem. And these are real-time things, and we need the church to be not just going, "Oh, isn't this exciting? I can do things that I don't have to have someone at the back with a clicker, registering how many people showed up this Sunday. I can just have an AI do it." well, where is that data going? What are you going to do with that data? What are the ways you're going to keep that person safe, let alone the safeguarding implications and many other issues besides. But these types of things are already happening. The technology is already there to use it. And I want us to use this technology. I don't want to sound like I'm saying put the brakes on, but you wouldn't get in a car with a great accelerator with no brake pedal. And we need to have both. And that's what we're advocating for, is we need to, go forward and try and find use cases for this stuff, but also know when we need to apply the brakes and make sure that we're driving on the right road.
Well, and I think that's a good point. I mean, that product probably isn't at market right now and hopefully not being developed, but it probably will be, and it probably will be released by somebody down the road, whether it's out of that source or a different source. And then you need the wisdom to figure it out. I was thinking when you were saying the unintended and the intended consequences of AI are in your church. Imagine a church in 2008. Just as Twitter was emerging, Facebook was starting to escape out of campuses saying, we're not doing social media. We're not doing, as we called it then, Web 2.0. It's banned in our church. We won't have an account. If that happened, and let's say you're still reaching people in 2024, which is a whole other question, everybody in your church, you're dealing with increased teen anxiety, depression, polarization, extremism. All of those things have happened to your church, even though you're off social media. And your argument is and a surprising number, I mean, Glue has done the studies on that, Glue and Barna, surprising number of people in the church are opposed to AI and saying, we're not going to use it. Well, first of all, you're probably already using it and don't realize it. Secondly, even if you did that, that doesn't mean your church isn't going to have a whole bunch of people, like meaningful percentages, in love with chatbots, using technology for malevolent purposes, not knowing ethically what to do as a Christian, about how to integrate it in their businesses and in their home, what to do with their teenagers. Their marriage broke up over AI. Like, all that stuff is coming in here.
It's all coming. And it's all coming, and it's also coming, for the church leader that might be listening, it's also coming into the actual delivery of ministry as well, right? We get this question all the time about, can I use ChatGPT to help me write a sermon? And I know that we can, because you and many others have worked on building helpful tools to help you do exactly that, because it can be done. But should we be asking it to write all of our prayers for a Sunday and just reading them verbatim? Should we be asking it to compose worship music and using that without the Spirit being part of that process? Like, these are really thorny theological issues that we have to try and unpick. And I don't think most churches, let alone have time to think about this stuff, or the knowledge or education to do so, and nor should they. They're not AI theologians sitting around thinking about this stuff. We need to equip them with this knowledge. But it's very much starting at the baseline of, do people know what the tools are? Do they know how they're being used? And crucially, are we thinking critically about them before we actually pick up and log in, before you click yes to the terms and conditions again without reading them, just because the thing looks like it's going to save you 2 hours of an afternoon? Like, these are the steps we need people to take, and to be aware that when we add technology to anything, we give it the opportunity for it to take over some of our decision making, which we might want, but we also give it the opportunity to take over some of our mistakes, which we don't want. And that's the thing that we want to be conscious of, is that if you wouldn't be willing to give this task to an assistant without checking what they were doing, don't give it to an AI to do it either. We need to stay in the loop and help use these tools responsibly, particularly in ministry context, if we want trust in the church to increase, to use your analogy of that trend line, rather than decrease, as it so often has done.
So what should the average church leader and the average business leader, because we have a lot of business leaders listening too, what questions should they be asking? What should they be paying attention to? What should they be doing right now?
Well, the first thing goes for either if you're in an enterprise context, or you're in a small business, or if you're a church leader or in a charity, is, do you even know what AI is being used in your organization? If you can't answer that question confidently, then that's the first place to start. And that might mean, yes, you need to do a survey and find out how many people have signed up to ChatGPT Plus with their private credit card and are charging it back. Or how many of you have turned on an AI module inside of your conferencing software without looking at how that data is being collected or stored? Do you know how the tools that you're using are using AI and what models are they using? Because we've seen, as we've said, AI has shown up now, not just in hey, I've bought an AI product. It's showing up in all of the technology we use, from the mailbox provider that you choose to things like Canva and Notion and Asana and all of the things that we use to kind of keep our day-to-day projects going in the digital ecosystem, and many of those being used obviously in the church as well. These all are beginning to have AI tools added to them. It may not be the headline, it may be just a part of the stack. And so first thing to do is pay attention to that. What's going on? Do you know what's being used? The second is actually to use some of it, and crucially to pay for some of it, which I know might seem counterintuitive. But what I mean by that is use some of these tools to get familiar with them. As I say, I don't think OpenAI, what they're trying to do is evil. I would endorse you go play around with Perplexity and ChatGPT, but do it in a responsible way where you're keeping things private that should stay private. Don't put anything on the internet that you won't want on the internet. It applies to AI tools as well. And comply with all of the usual things like GDPR and COPPA compliance if you're in the US, or whatever else regulations apply at the time of listening to this. Take those regular precautions, but go and play around. And why I say pay for it is because when you begin to pay for these tools, they are not using your time and attention as the currency. They're using your money as the currency in the interaction with these models. And that means that more often than not, you're not having any of your data go to train future versions of the model. You've got the ability usually to delete what you've put in, and that you can remove it if you want to, and that you will be getting enterprise level safety and security at both ends when you're sending data up and receiving it. When you pay for these things, you get those benefits. Yeah.
So when you pay, you're under a stricter level of privacy, security, et cetera, than when you're using the free stuff. Did not know that.
Just think of the difference between YouTube and YouTube Premium. What do you get when you pay for YouTube Premium? You don't get any ads, because you're no longer the product.
I happily pay for YouTube Premium and have for years.
That's $12.99 I pay every month.
Stand it. $12.99 a month, sign me up.
But it goes the same way. So when you pay for Perplexity Plus or Pro or whatever they call it, they're all called Pro Plus, Max, or Ultra, I think is usually the way. Mm-hmm. But whatever one you're paying for, the likelihood is that the terms of service have changed and you're no longer paying to train the model. Your data is yours.
There you go.
So again, you might not want to pay money to these people, and that's absolutely fine. But if you're going to use them, you're actually better off paying for it most of the time. So I would say first thing is know what's going on. Second is test it out. And then the third thing is be transparent, which is if you're going to use these tools, whether it's in the creation of ministry resources, whether it's in the administration of your business, whether it's managing the data of your people in whatever context, just be upfront and transparent with the people that are going to be affected by that. The best thing you can do is publish ethics policy or a transparency policy around AI, put it up on your website in the same way you would do with your privacy policy or other things. And just state how you're using tools, what you're using them for, crucially what you're not using them for, and be upfront with your congregation or your business about it. Because the last thing that anyone wants is for there to be some kind of sneaking suspicion that, hey, I think the vicar or the pastor or the minister is writing all of his sermons with ChatGPT, and it turns out to be true. At least if he's upfront about it, then maybe that's okay. But we don't want to be found out, and that's what we want to make sure that people are taken seriously.
I think there's a lot of fear around transparency. And I wonder if it's tied. I mean, you're working with the Church of England on ethics on this. I just read a case it might have been in the New York Times. They have an ethicist column, and this pastor served for 50 years, retired, and someone in the church just happenstance discovered another sermon that sounded an awful lot like one of his, and then went back through his work and discovered that they were all ripped off, right down to the stories that never happened to him. Like told someone else's story as though he had that vacation or been to that coffee shop, which to me is unconscionable. The ethicist was actually quite gentle, saying, "Oh, let this guy go into retirement." I'm like, no, he lied. And yet we've all used Google search for years, right? We've used Google and
thesaurus and concordances and assistant guides and all these other things as well.
Biblical commentaries. It's all digitized now. I still, I use ChatGPT for first drafts research. I've never found a good sermon to come out of AI yet. That's just me. But sometimes if I need something summarized or I want ideas rebuilt or tested, I will use it. So when it comes to disclosure, Like, it's one thing to get up there and say every Sunday, I used Google. I read 5 commentaries. I went back to the interlinear Greek. Nobody does that. But I have preached messages where I said, hey, a lot of these ideas in the message, and I'll give credit where they're due, came from a sermon I heard from Tim Keller, or Andy Stanley preached this series. I'm reteaching it right now, and it's got my own spin on it. But you need to know these ideas came first from Andy Stanley.
I think that's a great example. It's, what level of transparency would you give if you weren't on the internet? That should be the same level of transparency you give with the internet, whether it's AI or just Google. Like, that's fine. That's what we're asking for, because we want to be. It's a good principle in general. I think it's a Christian principle in general to be transparent about these things, not necessarily to the nth degree. Like you say, here's like my entire web search history that went into this. That's not necessary, but at least in the spirit of it is saying, hey, I used. Or maybe it's once a year, or it's part of your statement that's just up on the website somewhere or on social media that says, just so you know, these are the tools that I regularly use to help with my research and planning of this thing.
It hasn't happened to me yet where anything has come out of Claude or ChatGPT or other models where I'm like, ooh, this is like final draft 101. It's like, okay, I have a few ideas. Let's get moving. But I suppose the day is coming where ChatGPT will create a better sermon than I could write, or Claude would. I wonder.
Carey, you're a good preacher. There's a lot of like sermons that ChatGPT can write now that's better than a lot of sermons being written by humans. Let's be honest.
Perhaps. And then I guess you're at the point where if I borrowed a John Ortberg sermon, I'm just going to be like, hey, this started with John Ortberg. Or, I put my spin on it. Or maybe you stand up one day and go, you know what? ChatGPT spit out this amazing treatise on grace. And today I'm going to share, and a lot of it was done via ChatGPT. If it's like 90% that and 10% you, I'm trying to, like, for example, AI helped write me these questions for you. And I almost always, for the last year and a half, run questions and guests through ChatGPT or Claude. And then I sit down and I go, oh, I never would have thought to ask that. So it's always a mix. It's somewhere between sometimes half, and sometimes it's like, I kept one question or whatever. So it's just the idea of transparency. And I think you're right. Having a policy is really good. Do you have a downloadable one? I know Kenny Jang and Church.tech and people like that are working on that right now.
I have not replicated one because I would endorse the one that Kenny has. So definitely go to Church.tech and download his. It was with him last week as we were discussing exactly this. And this is the thing that I would recommend. So definitely going, if you don't follow Kenny, his AI for church leaders Facebook group is amazing. Church.tech is great. So definitely go and use that in the podcast. I recommend all his stuff. But I would say that that's where we do need to kind of we're getting more of these practical guidelines, right? We're getting practical guidelines that is beginning to emerge. I think the theology of this stuff is still something we're going to wrestle with for some time, because as these models emerge, what happens when a great Christian theology based model arrives that can write sermons that was based on hopefully people that opted into giving all of their sermon content over. Mm-hmm. It can create stuff, and then the question is, well, what is that? Is that spoken into by God? Can he use that stuff? And my answer would be yes. I think God can use all things, can't he? Like, that's what we believe. So it's but we particularly when it comes to teaching and preaching, we have this very specific call of ministry onto that thing, and we lump that in with the job of a church leader. And I think that's where we probably have gone a little bit wrong along the way. Is we say the church, for most church leaders listening to this, if that's your job, you probably are a staff member of one. We often think of the mega churches and the big places, and that's what a lot of the technology that's out there is catered to. But for most people, certainly here in the UK, the 17,000 churches across the Church of England that I get to work with from time to time, they're being led by one person who doesn't have time to do this stuff, and probably is trying to do all aspects of leading a church. And Carey, I know you know this firsthand, and not all of them are great preachers. In fact, some of them are really not great preachers at all. And they would be the first to admit it, because they didn't get into leading ministry to be a great preacher. They got into it to reach the poor, or to be evangelists, or to be missions. There's lots of different reasons. And I think when we think about these tools, there maybe is a possibility that they could come along and really help many people encounter the gospel in a way that they weren't able to before through the voice of the person in the local church who was speaking to them. But we need to work through some of these things in terms of like, what is our theology of that? And will we accept that that can be part of the future of what ministry looks like, without necessarily going to the nth degree of saying, we'll just stick ChatGPT with a voice assistant at the front of church every Sunday and leave them to it.
Well, you bring your heart to it. You know, there's a Canadian doctrine. I was just doing a quick legal search from back in law school. It's I don't think it's common law, so it could be in England too. It's called passing off. And it doesn't mean this, but in my head, I always take that term and apply it to church world. If I take, you know, someone else's sermon or someone else's book, like I've got William Urey's here on my desk, and I'm like reading you chapter 1, and I pretend it's my work, I'm passing it off as though I did all the work, I did all this stuff. And I think that's out of bounds. Like, I don't care whether it's analog or digital. If you're pretending to do something that you didn't do. On the other hand, great books have great footnotes. And, you know, a Tim Keller joke that's been told on this podcast once or twice, he was famous for saying, well, first of all, almost any random sermon you listen to by Tim Keller probably has 25 to 50 references in it. As C.S. Lewis says, as Miroslav Volf says, as this person says, as this person says. And you don't think anything of it. You just think, wow, that guy reads widely, which he does. And he says, you know, when I have time to write an original sermon, that's how it goes. When I'm out of time, I just quote C.S. Lewis, you know. But he always quoted C.S. Lewis. He never passed off. He would say, as C.S. Lewis said, as C.S. Lewis said, you know, it's sort of a joke. But one of the most profound thinkers of this generation, you know, Tim Keller, and he was quoting people left, right, and center. So if you're using ChatGPT, throw your heart into it, but just say, hey, I had some help from this, or I had some help here. But I think as a pastor, you have to, and as a leader, I was reading an article a friend sent me from the Wall Street Journal, and it was saying, you know, what's happening to tech. Axios is a media organization, and they're saying we're humanizing the news at a very deep level. They were founded in 2017 from people, I think, who started Politico. And they're going, we're humanizing this at a very deep level. I think when you bring your humanity to the task, when I bring my humanity to this show, when it's actually me asking you the questions, and as you note, like most guests do, how many actual questions I sent you did I actually use? Very few, because we're having a great conversation. And, you know, but any agree, disagree? I'd love your thoughts on that.
Well, no, so I agree. I think that we all have to, you know, weigh it ourselves as to how much of my own humanity do I want to bring to any of these things that we do with AI, whether that's preaching a sermon, whether that's writing the annual address, whether it's writing a birthday poem for a friend, you know, whatever it might be, or writing your, hopefully you're not writing your wife's Christmas card, you know, kind of like a missive using AI, but you might, you can do all these things. We have to bring our humanity to it and weigh each of these things up individually. I mean, Carey, I'll turn it on you. Like, how would you feel about the idea of a Carey bot in the future, long after you've, you know, kind of gone to be with the Lord, you know, and all of your sermon content, you know, falls over into the public domain? Like, do you want people interacting with Carey 3.0 in the future, and, you know, downloading future versions of sermons that you never wrote? Like, write me a sermon on, you know, kind of 1 Corinthians 13 with the theology of C.S. Lewis in the style of Carey Nieuwhof. Like, what would that look like?
Yeah, I find that very problematic. First of all, you know, we were talking about this as a team very recently. I think most of the work I've done in this life is going to disappear in a generation. There's very few people who get read beyond their demise. But I think, honestly, it's a great question, JP. Unless things get upended very, very quickly, I think the one thing that has the potential to outlive you is a book you write.
That's right.
Podcasts come and go, blog posts come and go, social media posts vaporize with the dawn. I think it's a book. And what I like about a book when they're well done is, you know, a book's taken you anywhere from a lifetime to multiple years to produce. It's your best thinking on an issue. It's 30, 40, 50, 70,000 words on a dedicated subject. And it makes a long form argument that you just can't make on digital means. You can't do it. And so, you know, alternatively, you know, if you have a lecture series, you're a professor, it probably has that level of thought to it and lecture notes, but often lectures endure when they get published. So I think if you have a tome of work that might be, by the time I'm gone, hopefully I've written 8 or 9 books, and that's plenty for a lifetime. Maybe one of them has a chance to be helpful beyond my death, but the sermon chatbot for Charles Spurgeon, I'm sure is coming if it hasn't been invented yet. But I think if you have legacy thinkers or people who really helped shape the thought of a generation, that perhaps a chatbot would be helpful. I think for most of us, myself included, it's like you made a contribution in your lifetime. You did a good job. And most people tend, Gordon MacDonald told me years ago, and he's written some amazing books. I was asking him advice as I stepped back from the teaching team and retired at Connexus and just became a congregant. He said, Carey, they forget you quickly. And he was so accurate. And that's humbling, but you just have to realize your place in the culture. And I wouldn't have any. Now, I think while I'm alive, we're working on a Carey bot so that people can ask me questions and spit out. I have thousands of articles and, ideas and published sources out there. We'll feed all that into the GPT and it'll pump out, or LLM, it'll pump out hopefully accurate answers. We haven't been able to get it accurate enough yet, but when we do get it, I don't want to be responsible for saying things I didn't mean and never intended to say.
Well, I look forward to playing around with it. I might even write my own sermon or two using.
That'd be great. That'd be great. So I'm going to ask you 1 or 2 more questions and then open the floor to you. What do you wish churches were doing with AI that they're not doing right now?
Wow. I mean, there is a lot just to kind of get off the starting blocks with, which is, again, we have this wonderful opportunity, don't we, like in church ministry to, bring people into relationship with Jesus and have them grow and be nurtured and be discipled. But the thing that often gets in the way of that is just the day-to-day drudgery of managing our money, managing our teams, putting people on rotas, all of this stuff. So one of the big things I just wish churches would be doing is seeing this massive opportunity that's in front of them to pick up a bunch of things that might just make that task a little bit easier this week, this month. Think about, particularly in the post-digital age and post-COVID, we're all wrestling with having to basically compete for attention on social media, to create content, to bring people through the doors. It's the primary place that people are spending time and money in terms of evangelism and outreach. But that, not most churches don't have a church staff. As I said before, most churches are one person with an army of well-meaning volunteers. And so they don't have teams that can help do the social media posting or manage a schedule or put together a rota. And if they are doing it, they're often having to do it in their spare time. So I think one of the big things is that churches would adopt some of these things just to get the basics done, and spend more of their well-earned time and their congregation's resources on that, rather than having to relearn how to do another 3 social media posts in Canva next Sunday.
So what's fascinating? I've got a personal story on that. We had some family over a couple weeks ago, and I have a niece who started her own business, and she wasn't at the table, but her mom was, and she was just saying how overwhelming it was for my niece to try to come up with social media, but she wants to get the word out. And I'm like, well, have you used AI? So we literally just brought my laptop to the kitchen counter, and I used a couple of AIs and just entered a prompt that said, here's the name of the salon, here's the name of the person, this is the location, this is specialization, create a social media plan that for the next 30 days on her Instagram account. Literally, strategy, exact text, everything, image suggestions in about 25 seconds. And my sister-in-law started to cry. She's like, this exists? I'm like, absolutely. And that was I think I was paid.
I've done the same thing with a teacher that I know, a friend of mine who's a teacher. She teaches the 4th grade here in the UK. And I showed her how to transcribe a YouTube video, turn it into a quick, short story analogy for her class, and then write a bunch of follow-up questions. And, to that same reaction, just, people's eyes light up, and like, this stuff is actually here. The thing that I really want people to do is not just use it, but know how to use it really well. Like, that's where the real game changer is. So, I don't know if you did this with your example with your friend, but, telling it to not just write a social media policy, but tell it, hey, you're going to behave like an absolute social media expert. You know everything that you need to know about how to post on this platform. You've learned from all of the big influencers. And now this is all the information I want you to go and produce for me. Those little tweaks in the prompt do amazing things.
They still work. Okay, that's good to know.
They still work. And these models, they produce some fascinating results when you give them a bit of personality to respond in before you get started. So I think that's the other thing I want people to do, is use them well.
Well, there's a lot of stuff we could get to, but we've been an hour on this already. Anything we haven't touched on that you'd like to touch on?
I think the main thing I would say is that I think that those, speaking to anyone that's kind of working in technology or working in leadership right now, has a responsibility when it comes to AI that they may not think about, which is that we are the last generation, maybe the most anxious, according to Jonathan Haidt, but we're the last generation of people, of leaders, that will remember what life was like before and after this technology has existed. Like my kids, I've got, at the time of recording, a 9-year-old and a 6-year-old. They will not know what life is like to go through school, to go into university, to work in a workplace, to talk to a social media thing, and not question whether or not is this a real person or is this an AI. Mm-hmm. Like we're the last generation to remember what that's like. And so I think as leaders, as technologists, as particularly people working in ministry, we're the last people to remember what that truly disconnected experience was like. And we want to try and look for what was the gold in that we want to bring into the next generation and hold on to. And what are the things that we want our AIs, we want our technology to look like in the future, so that we end up in that more positive view of where that future curve might go, rather than the more negative. Because I think we only get one shot at it. We've seen so many times before that when this technology or any technology gets out of the box, there is no real putting it back in there. And we're seeing obviously efforts at the moment to do that with social media. We don't want to have to go through the same thing with AI. And I think that's our responsibility. It's all of our responsibility. And it comes back to the point I made at the start, which is you can wait for the government to regulate a model, or you can hope that a benevolent AI council arises out of the big 7 companies running the show, or you and your neighbors and your children and the people that you work with take collective responsibility to say, this is what we want this to look like in the future, and behave accordingly. And not just give in to the easy thing, not to give in to the lazy thing, and not just give up more utility for our privacy and end up with unintended consequences. That's what I really want people to try and do.
I think that is a fantastic call to action for older listeners. So I got the internet when I was 31. I got my first smartphone when I was 40, and it was a BlackBerry. And I was so excited that I could get emails on it. It was, primitive, Philistine compared
I
to
missed
what we
my
have
BlackBerry
now.
curve quite
Yeah, I know. Again, you're too young. You're too young. But you know what is interesting? And I've often thought about pre-digital memory, but I was really thinking about it. I'm not young as a leader anymore. And it's like, but I do know what life was like before we all got the internet. The prototype of the internet, the dial-up internet. And I think, if you think about what it means to be human, I have an interest in philosophy. It's people like Voltaire, it's people like Sartre, it's people like Kierkegaard and, Nietzsche to some extent, although he was pretty dystopian, who really help us think.
Positive outlook.
Not the most positive outlook. And theologians who make us think about what life is really about. It would be wonderful in these next few decades, while those of us who remember that are still alive, because we won't be in 30, 40 years, to note what it means to be human and to really think about that. Because I think you're right. Like, civilization is about to change fundamentally and inalienably forever. And maybe one of our contributions, because a lot of older leaders feel useless. They feel like, oh, my time is gone. I'm not a young leader anymore. I think to be able to reflect and prayerfully think through the theological, philosophical dimensions of what was it like to be the last generation to grow up with a pre-digital memory and to interact as human beings and to have meaning in your life. What does that look like? And then, the next generation will separate the wheat from the chaff and figure out what it keeps and what it discards. But that is a tremendous help, I think, to people who are older. And don't think you have to write a book. Just get together with some 25-year-olds and have conversations. That's a beautiful call to action.
And, Carey, I think the thing that I hold on to is that God could have chose to create anything.
Yeah.
He could have could have chosen to create us as silicon-based intelligences,
True.
but he chose to build us as carbon ones. And I often have this phrase that I say a lot, which is that matter matters. We are physical, 3D, living our life out in the dimension of time for a reason, because that's the way that God intended it. And we don't want to lose sight of that we get a lot of these kind of digital fantasists that live inside of the Silicon Valley bubble, thinking that the future is us all being downloaded onto a chip and having, endless life in that way. And that's just not the model that we've been given. And I think we want to hang on to that as best as we can and be the story that, speaks into society that, matter matters and that we are built to be with one another in an embodied way, because that's, he came to earth, right, in bodily form for a reason. He didn't speak to us through a chatbot.
Fascinating. JP, people are going to want to track with you. Where will they find you online these days, and any resources you want to direct people to in particular?
Yeah. Well, I'm sure you'll find the links to the show notes, but you'll find me at James Poulter at pretty much every social media platform you need to. I write mostly over on LinkedIn, if that's your place or you like to hang out. And if you are interested, I suppose, in getting more information about how to follow along with what we're doing at Ecclesiae, go to ecclesiae.org. That's AECCLESI. That's the Ecclesiae AI bit.org. Ecclesiae.org, and you'll get the resources, follow the research, and engage in the conversation.
Fantastic. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Carey.